The last time I read this piece, it was at Saints and Sinners a year ago, and I read to like a room of 7 people. And so it's nice to be able to like look out and actually see people that I can interact with, and it's fun. And it's a story that's meant to be read out loud. And it's in one of those voices that I met in a bar and decided to take home with me. I don't know what that's going to accomplish later, but I fondly call this my big gay fairy tale. It's actually called And They Lived. Tell me a story, you say. I'd love to, but I've run out of stories. Or rather, the stories have run out of me. You snuggle up to me and nestle yourself in the crook of my arm. You turn your ear toward my lips, knowing I cannot resist the urge to whisper. There is only one story left for me to tell. Forgive me if you've heard this one before. Stories, like energy, are neither created nor destroyed, but exist only to be refashioned and pressed into something new. So listen carefully. Once upon a time, there was a princess and a servant girl. They fall in love, but the princess has already been promised to a duke. Well, they fall in love anyway. Eventually, the princess realizes it would never work between her and the servant girl. She does not love the duke, but marries him anyway. The servant girl goes on being a servant, and they live happily ever after. But you don't believe that, do you? We don't believe in endings anymore, and God forbid they be happy. It's the easy way out. We want to trip over loose ends, anticipate the sequel. Ironic because there isn't anything easy about happiness. Ironic because should we snap our heads around in a double take, we'd find the fairy tale world in shambles. Tell you what, you'll be the princess, and I'll be the servant girl. The story begins the same way. The servant girl discovers her lady face down on the bed, sobbing into the pillows. She sits alongside the princess, awkwardly stroking the hair that cascades past the small of her lady's back. She knows she's overstepping her boundaries, but the princess does not reprimand her. On the contrary, she seems to yield to the servant's touch. With her free hand, the servant fingers her own stringy, tangled, greasy hair under her wimple. The servant discovers that the princess has been promised to a nobleman, a duke or a viscount. The servant isn't too keen on details, and she is to be wed within the year. No more romping around the countryside, no more arriving at the banquet hall with mud splashed on her neck. Now she has to appear at court and be a real lady. She descends back into sobs which rack her body violently. The servant girl holds her arms out and her lady folds herself into them. The servant stares at the dirt under her fingernails and reminds herself of what she is. She cannot, should not, feel things like this. It's a sin, surely. She has been told as much. These hands should not touch a lady in such a manner. Still, there is some kind of electricity in that embrace. Eventually, their lips meet. They sleep together. They arrange to meet in a horse stall to make love again the next day. They fall in love, and so on. You know the story. 2 hearts break, but only one gets a compromise, a consolation prize. The other is turned into a witch or a master thief, capable of the worst kinds of coercion. But this is not that story. The princess and the servant were always aware of the time limit. When the duke comes riding in on his black stallion, the 2 lovers cease to be. The time bomb they've been throwing back and forth explodes in midair. They bar the doors to the servant at the princess's wedding. Even though she scrubs herself raw, the cross-armed guards spit through their mangled teeth as they laugh and shoo her away. So she scales the cathedral wall and, hunched by a gargoyle, sees the princess kiss the scraggly young face of the duke. In nomine patris. The servant's insides burst open, the thousands of colors from the stained glass window splattered on the bride's white dress. The servant girl realizes 1 second too late that her heart, now under the heel of the duke, will break and break and break until it turns to dust. It is night. The servant creeps, ivy-like, up to the bedroom window. She crouches like a cat in the corner of a balcony. She won't be noticed. She sees the princess naked in front of the duke, and he is clamoring over his new wife like a lost puppy. He tears at her thighs as if he were gnawing on a leg of lamb, but he could learn. There is tenderness in him. The princess could even learn to love him. The servant sees the princess and the duke move together. She watches the princess's face for any sign of pleasure, the same way I do when you tell me about your past lovers. It's painful, you know, hearing about someone else, someone before me, someone who touched you and pleased you and knew you and loved you. Not better, but different. Sometimes in ways I couldn't even dream of. Jealousy swells in the servant's chest as she watches and watches until the princess and the duke fall asleep on opposite sides of the bed. The moonlight splashes across the princess's face. The servant dares to inch toward the window. The duke hears something moving on the balcony. He sits up in bed, his warrior instincts tingling like the hairs on the back of his neck. He calls the guard. The guard rushes in, eager to win his lord's favor. He jumps on the balcony and catches the servant girl by the collar as she tries to escape. The guard strides back into the bedchamber and throws the servant girl at the foot of the bed like a dead doe. The servant girl trembles. The lady asks the servant girl why she was spying on them. The servant doesn't answer, only holds the princess's gaze for an apologetic second. Much is said between them, wordlessly. And then, with a dash of her hair, the princess turns toward the duke, and the servant girl is dragged out of the room. Outside the bedchamber, the guard rapes the servant. She doesn't scream. If she screams, she will be killed, though now she knows there are things worse than death. As the guard batters her, she hears the princess's cries on the other side of the door. Tears stream down the girl's face long after the guard leaves his filthy taste in her mouth and a child in her belly. Later, she will swallow a concoction of herbs, and a few days later, the shame and horror of that night will flow from between her legs. For a few more months, the servant goes on attending to her mistress until one day, when the princess, who is now a duchess, moves to her husband's fertile lands only to find herself barren. And they lived. Please don't say happily ever after. No one could live happily after all that. Says who? It just doesn't make sense. Of course it doesn't. The end isn't really the end. They keep living, striving for happiness until they die. But none of that is very interesting. Well, that's not fair. Of course it's not. Lay out your story from birth to death, hour to hour, minute to minute. What do you remember? What would you cut out? What would you not let me see? Streamline a life, scale it, bone it, make it palatable, serve it and sell it. A story is not a fish. Well, should I try again? Yes, be the princess this time. The story begins the same way.